Hi everybody, welcome to A Course in Miracles Applied. Today's topic is a line from the text from chapter 11, section 4, the inheritance of God's Son. And the line is, you cannot enter God's presence if you attack his Son. Specifically, it's in chapter 11, section 4, paragraph 5. And this is sentence number 6. I remember Ken had done a whole workshop, I think, on this chapter, and specifically on this line. So what does this mean, and what does this mean for our practice with the Course, right? It's a pretty absolute statement. It's very clear that we cannot have peace if we attack our brother and ourselves, right? Basically, there's a block that prevents us from entering God's peace, and that block is the attack on God's Son. Now, on the flip side, basically it would say, if you want to enter God's presence, don't attack his Son. Right? If you want to enter God's presence, don't attack his Son. Another way of looking at it is, if we don't feel peaceful right now, at this very moment, it must be because we have attacked God's Son. Because this statement isn't just in the future. It seems like this is in the future, right? You cannot enter God's presence if you attack his Son, seems to be a future statement, or we have to do one thing in order for something else to occur. So if we flip this around and we become aware that we are not at peace right now, the only reason we're not at peace right now is because we have attacked God's Son. And I know we have spoken about this before, but the ego is very sneaky that way, that we're not really aware of that attack, right? We don't believe, or we don't think for a second that judging somebody, even if it's the slightest judgment with regard to their body or how they behave or what they say or what they didn't say, is an attack on God's Son. And if it's an attack on God's Son, it must be an attack on God. Right? The Course says this world was made as an attack on God. So everything in this world is an attack on God, and this attack on God, we hide that from ourselves, and then we attack our brothers, and then we hide that. Right? So that's the double shield of oblivion, right, that the Course talks about. So we cannot enter God's presence if we attack his Son, and if we are not in God's presence, which means if we're not totally peaceful and feeling love for everyone with no exclusions, we must have attacked his Son. So it's pretty clear, right? It's a pretty clear statement. There's not much to kind of discuss or think it could mean something different. I don't know how that sounds. It's like, is it like nails on chalkboard, or is it really chalk on chalkboard? Because if it sounds like nails on chalkboard, we should probably not do it, or I should probably not do it. But anyway, so we cannot enter God's presence if we attack God's Son. If you go into the web version of the course at the acim.org and you put in attack his son, a bunch of things come up, 10 results. And interestingly enough, if one of them is, or the second one is, you cannot enter God's presence if you attack his son, the third line, the second quote, actually, sorry, it's the third quote on this, says something that is interesting, which is, guilt remains the only thing that hides the Father, for guilt is the attack upon his Son. So if we have attack here in the middle, then we would have guilt up here, right? And that is a very powerful statement. This statement basically explains the whole ego thought system in one sentence. Guilt remains the only thing that hides the Father, right? So we usually have our I'm just going to put God up here and Father as a symbol for oneness and heaven and eternity and such. So God, the Father, and the Father. So guilt is what hides the Father. Guilt is what hides God from us, right? And the Course says that this guilt is so intense that it has to be projected. Guilt is so intense that it has to be projected outward. And the projection of guilt, that is the attack, right? Anger is the projection of guilt outward, and that is the attack. So the attack is always taking, or the attempt of taking our own guilt, pushing it to the outside. The attack is the projection of the guilt outward, and then we see the guilt in somebody else. And Jesus says you cannot enter God's presence if you attack his Son, which means you cannot enter God's presence if you project your guilt onto your brother. I don't know how well you can see this, but we have sin on top of guilt, right? Sin is the cause for guilt. The guilt isn't just there. The guilt is the effect of our belief in sin, which stems from our belief that we have successfully shattered the oneness of heaven. We have successfully murdered the love of God, right? We have killed, we have destroyed our home, and we have successfully separated from God, and that is what the ego tells us, a sin. And that sin follows a tremendous amount of guilt that then is so severe is the word that I was not remembering before. The guilt is so severe that it needs to be projected out. We project the guilt outward, and that is the attack on God's Son. So it's really interesting because we might think, or we do think, that the attack on God's Son is the problem, right? We believe the problem is I'm judging people. And I have to somehow stop that, right? Or get rid of that. We believe the attack on God is the problem. If we wouldn't have attacked God in separating from him, in making our own existence, we wouldn't feel, it wouldn't be as there would be no sin, we wouldn't feel guilty, we wouldn't have to attack others, and in the final outcome, we would not experience fear, right? Because we have sin, guilt, attack, and fear. Those are the 4 stages of that descent into the darkness of the ego thought system and into the world, right? This is the sequence of events. It all happens in 1 second. Each time it always happens in 1 second, but we're just breaking it down a little bit to understand what the actual issue is. And we tend to, and myself included, when we work with the course and we attack somebody and we become aware of judgments and stuff like that, we tend to feel guilty about it, right? And then we try to overcome this guilt or compensate for this guilt by not judging or by not attacking our brother. And we think if we don't attack our brother, we're gonna enter the presence, God's presence, right? And even though this is a very clear sentence and it is 100% true, you cannot enter God's presence if you attack his Son, there are a couple of steps that go on in our mind prior to that. So in one sense, and that's just Jesus talking about the same issue from many, many, many angles, and just jumping in here and saying, let me explain this to you from this angle, right? And with regard to attack, then he has other ways where he explains the same thing with regard to guilt, projection, perception, interpretation of that perception, and then how fear comes in. So he just explains the very same thing over and over again in different ways. And one of them, hopefully, we realize, oh, wait a minute, this is me, right? I do that. I do that all the time, or I do that once in a while, and then we can start realizing, generalizing it to our life and saying, okay, this is everything, right? I'm attacking everybody all the time. And it might not be everybody, it might not be all the time, but I always think for purposes of learning, it is wiser to say, I'm probably doing it more than I think, right? Because of the iceberg. We're gonna have a whole segment on the iceberg, but I'm gonna put the iceberg behind me just for now. Right, so this is the tip of the iceberg, and this is what we're aware of, right? And the guilt is in the underwater. This is the water. We're aware of the top, and we're not aware of what's under the surface. And that, what's under the surface, is what we see in the outside world. That is the projection of our guilt. That is the attack on his Son. So, right? So we cannot have peace if we cannot enter God's presence if we attack God's Son. And guilt is the attack upon God's Son. Guilt remains the only thing that hides the Father, for guilt is the attack upon his Son. We attack God's Son, we feel guilty, but we have to project the guilt. We feel guilty, we have to project the guilt. We feel guilty. It's a vicious cycle. It's a foolproof system that the ego has developed, and we can't get out from within the system because we are in a whirlpool. This is the negative whirlpool not the positive whirlpool, that the attraction of God, but this is the negative whirlpool where we are stuck in this circular movement with attack, the cycle. So let me just see if I can get this. I don't know if I have the right words to find it so quickly. I guess not. Basically says attack, defense, defense, attack. This is the cycle of the day, something like that. Oh, here it is. Workbook lesson 153. It is as if a circle held it fast, wherein another circle bounded, and another one in that, until escape no longer can be hoped for nor obtained. Attack, defense, defense, attack become the circles of the hours and the days that bind the mind in heavy bands of steel with iron overlaid, returning but to start again. There seems to be no break nor ending in the ever-tightening grip of the imprisonment upon the mind. So if you have ever felt, which I'm 100% sure you have, we all have, this no break nor ending in the ever-tightening grip of the imprisonment upon the mind, if you have ever felt that imprisonment of the mind where we think there's no way out of this vicious cycle inside, right? And we can't pinpoint it. We just feel trapped or lost or in such a tight space in our mind that we can't even imagine to get out ever again. That is that attack, guilt, attack, and fear cycle we are talking about. Attack, defense, defense, attack become the circles of the hours and the days, right? So anytime we don't feel complete peace, it is because we are in this cycle. We're caught in this cycle, right? And the Course says you cannot enter God's presence, or you cannot get out of this when you attack his Son. And then he says guilt remains the only thing that hides the Father, for guilt is the attack upon his Son. So guilt remains the only thing that hides the Father, which means guilt in that cycle, right? And Jesus, I think a lot of times sin and guilt are simultaneously because they happen instantaneously. If there is a belief in sin, guilt is immediately there, right? We're just going to break it down a little bit more and make a distinction between sin and guilt, even though they come in the same moment, right? There's not one without the other, right? If you can't have guilt without sin. And once a sin is there, guilt follows. So what is that? What is the, well, how do we get out of that whirlpool of condemnation, of defense, attack, attack, defense, defense, attack, of this cycle, right? And Jesus says you cannot enter God's presence when you attack his Son. So we might think, what I said in the beginning, that, okay, logically, what would follow this statement would be, okay, if I don't attack God's Son, I will be able to enter God's presence. And then we might try to pretend we don't attack God's Son, right? And that is a very normal occurrence. It is the most natural occurrence. If we read this course and Jesus says you cannot enter God's presence if you attack his Son, oh, I have to stop attacking his Son, right? But what we have to realize is, why are we attacking God's Son? Right? If we don't ask the question why we attack God's Son, we cannot stop attacking God's Son. So this sentence is an intermediate step. It basically explains a massive cause and effect relationship. The cause is our attack on God's Son, and the effect is we cannot enter heaven. Basically, if you cannot enter God's presence, which means we are in hell. We are in hell because we attack God's Son. And now we just go a little bit deeper and say, why is it that we attack God's Son? If Jesus says you would be in peace if you wouldn't attack God's Son. And we ask the question, why do we attack God's Son? Right? And the reason why we attack God's Son is our belief, our deep experience of guilt. Right? Up here we say, oh, no, we're not guilty. I don't feel guilty. And below the surface is this massive amount of guilt that is an illusion from Jesus's perspective, but for us it's very real, and it makes absolutely no sense to deny that we believe with every fiber of our being that we are guilty. In fact, our whole body is based, the setup of our body is based on the principle of one or the other, which is the original principle of us separating from God. And if we exist as an individual, God must be dead, and he wants to take the life back that we have stolen from him, which then we have the sin, the guilt, and the attack, and then the fear follows, the fear of God. So it makes no sense to deny that this whole world, as we said before, the world is made as an attack on God. This body originally was made as an attack on God. Right? We took this, what was in the mind, which is the manifestation of the principle of one or the other, us versus God, and we projected it outward. And what comes out of that is, for example, if you take the body, if you go into biology, and it is interesting that science completely agrees with the Course. I know it's crazy, but science is 100% in agreement with the Course, except for one thing, which is the biggest thing. But anyway, so our cells, the cells of our body, right? The only way we can grow is for cells to separate from each other. It's not one cell that expands into this. It's one cell that divides, and multiplies, changes slightly. One becomes an eye, one becomes an eyelid, right? So separation is the very essence of our life. Plant life, animal life, human life, right? The separation, one, and then the other principle is the one or the other principle, right? If I want to exist, oxygen particles have to be, the oxygen has to be removed so I can live, right? Something else has to die, whether it's a carrot or a cow, or whether it's water I have to drink, or air to breathe. Something else has to die in order for me to live. And you can spiritualize it and say, well, this is just transformation of energy. But the thought behind it is that we cannot live without something external giving us life. And that is the whole idea of the ego thought system, to push everything to the outside, right? So the world becomes, as the Course says, the world was made as an attack on God. We said separation is real. I have to get my guilt out. I have to get the guilt away from me. I have to make a place where God cannot enter, right? We hide in our body from the oneness of heaven. We hide in the opposite of heaven, which is the matter, right? Which is the whatever can be threatened. And when Jesus says nothing real can be threatened, it means heaven. In this world, everything can be threatened. It's the opposite of the oneness of heaven. So we did all this as an attack on God, and the representation of that would be the sentence, you cannot enter God's presence if you attack his son. Right? So we basically, in order to enter God's presence, we have to learn how to forgive. And how do we learn how to forgive? Right? We said already that trying not to attack is not the answer, because the attack is an effect, not a cause. In this sentence, we're not in the peace of God, which is the effect. The cause is the attack. And then there are different sections in the course where Jesus says, okay, but the attack is also only the effect, right? For guilt is the attack upon God's Son. Without guilt, there would be no attack. Without guilt, there would not be the need to project that guilt outward. So guilt, if we experience guilt, we cannot enter God's presence. Right? We're just going one step back. Guilt remains the only thing that hides the Father. We cannot enter God's presence if we feel guilt, if we believe in our own guilt, which then we have to project out, which is the attack. Right? Guilt remains the only thing that hides the Father. Guilt remains the only thing that stops us from experiencing the love of God. Our belief in guilt is the only problem the world has. It's the only problem we have. Any problems we have, if you name 100 problems, the cause is always the same. It is always our own belief in guilt. Without guilt, guilt remains the only thing that hides the Father. Without guilt, our Father would not be hidden. Without guilt, the Christ would not be hidden from our brother. We would see the Christ in our brother very clearly, in everyone we look upon. Right? So guilt is the only thing that hides the Father. And we have done this before. Just to reiterate, if you think about, if this is the Christ, right? And it is, you can take this very literally. Take this very literally, right? This is guilt. This piece of paper is guilt, right? So if this is the Christ, which is the symbol for the love of God, the Father, guilt remains the only thing that hides the Father, right? Guilt hides the Father from our sight. Guilt hides the Christ from our awareness to see the Christ in our brother. The only thing that hides the Christ in our brother is guilt, and it cannot be somebody else's guilt. It must be our own guilt that we have projected out onto his Son through the attack. So attack is the process of pushing the guilt onto our brother, so it hides the face of Christ, right? Guilt is the attack upon his son, and guilt remains the only thing that hides the Father. So our own guilt is the only thing that hides God from our awareness. Let's go one step further. We're not quite there yet, right? We asked, why is the attack on God, why is the attack on our brother the reason? What's behind that attack? And behind that attack is our belief in guilt, right? And behind our belief in guilt is our belief in sin. And there's a really good paragraph. If you put citadel in the search function of the online course, Citadel, it says, there is no stone in all the ego's embattled citadel that is more heavily defended than the idea that sin is real. The natural expression of what the Son of God has made himself to be and what he is. There is no stone in all the ego's embattled citadel that is more heavily defended than the idea that sin is real. Sin, the belief in sin, is the only way the ego can buy the Son's alliance. Without sin, there's no guilt. Without the belief in sin, there's no guilt. Without guilt, there's no attack. Without attack, there's no fear. What's left is the presence of God. And I'm telling you this now. I just realized that half an hour ago, actually, in this way, is the sin is the belief that the separation is real and that it's had tremendous consequences, right? And that is the sin. And the guilt is an effect, the attack is an effect, the fear is an effect. And Jesus basically explains a lot of the effects and says, listen, in order to get to that, I want you to get to this point where you question, with Jesus' help, your own belief in sin. I want you to question that, he says, in many, many words. We're going to question it together, but in order to question it, we have to look at it in all its different facets, right? We can't hide any hidden guilt or anywhere in this iceberg. We have to explore this iceberg, and this iceberg is explored by looking out into the world and seeing our own guilt there. And that leads us to that belief in sin that we have buried deep under this hole, under the surface of this world and this body, is our belief in sin. And he wants us to look at that, because that is the one thing that the ego will try to defend with its very life, right? And the ego says, no, don't go there. You don't have to look at that. Let's concentrate on the love, right? Let's concentrate on the positive. Because if we don't eradicate, which means look at it with Jesus next to us, at this belief in sin, which causes the guilt, causes the attack, causes the fear, causes this whole world and our pain, right? If we don't look at that with Jesus, it will stay there, right? It is the most heavily defended idea the ego has, is our belief in guilt. It must try for us to always believe that without knowing that we believe it. Otherwise, we will decide against it. Without sin, the only thing we have left is this thought of separation. And without sin, separation is silly. It's simply just a silly thought, a tiny mad idea. It's nothingness, right? Why would you be separate why would we want to be separate if the presence of God is what we want to deny? We wouldn't want to deny it anymore. But the only reason we deny the presence of God is that in our mind, very powerful belief in sin that leads to this vast experience of guilt needs to be projected out. Attack, fear, defense, attack, fear, defense, the cycle and the whirlpool of the ego. So the only thing we need to ever worry about is our own belief in sin that expresses itself in this experience of guilt and that is being pushed out into the world that we see everywhere. So the reality of sin is the most heavily defended idea the ego has. Because of this idea of sin, we believe in sin, the guilt follows. This is so severe we have to project it out, which means we have to attack God's Son. So if we think we can just stop attacking God's Son and that's the solution, we're missing two major steps. Right? That's why the Course says, trust not your good intentions. They're not enough. Our good intentions are, we read a line like this and we think, okay, I have to stop attacking his Son. It makes absolute sense, right? It's logical. First of all, Jesus tells me to do it. I should do it. We don't realize that this part of us wants to do it and this part says, no way. I don't want to do this. If I don't attack God's Son, that means the guilt. So if I don't attack God's Son and I still believe in guilt, that means the guilt is with me. And if the guilt is with me, then God will come and get me, because God hunts the guilty. That's the ego. That's what the ego tells us. God goes after the guilty ones. So you better take your guilt, you push it out, you see it in somebody else, you attack just at random. Everybody that you can possibly attack, you should attack, because you want to make sure your guilt is seen outside. And Jesus says you cannot enter God's Son, you cannot enter God's presence if you attack his Son. And we think about that and say, okay, good. So there's a connection between I cannot enter God's presence if I attack. Then the next thing he says is guilt is what hides the Father from you. Okay, good. And the next thing is he says sin is the most heavily defended principle in the ego's arsenal. Because without sin, the whole ego's thought system will collapse. It doesn't collapse if we stop attacking. It doesn't collapse if we're not afraid for a little while. Because the fear is an effect, attack is an effect, guilt is an effect, sin is a cause. The thought of separation is not a cause. It's nothing. It's a tiny mad idea. Only when we believe that this is a sin, which means it can actually happen. Only if we believe it can happen does the sin arise, guilt arises, attack, and then fear. So this thought of separation is not the problem. It's a tiny mad idea. It's nothing. What is the problem is our deep, deep, deep belief in sin. Here, this is our belief in sin, right? It has this guilt as a natural consequence. And we need Jesus to look at this with us. We can't do it alone because our belief in the sin is too big. So we need something outside of this insanity, because this is literally an insane premise that the Son of God is guilty and worthy of attack. It's an insane premise, but we're so desperate at this very moment right now that we're constantly attacking, and we don't know that we're doing it. Because if we don't experience the presence of God or Jesus right now, at this very moment, you're watching this channel, if you don't experience the presence of God that is completely all-encompassing, it must be because we're attacking God's Son, which means we must feel guilty, which means we must believe we have sinned. So Jesus says, okay, let's look at every time you're afraid. And I'm going to tell you in this course that any emotion that you have is basically fear. He tells us that. So you look out into the world, you go through your day, and you realize everything that is not love is fear. So you can work with that. Then we will go back one step and say, you can only feel that fear because you think you have attacked God's Son. Because the fear comes after the attack. There cannot be fear without the attack. So Jesus says, okay, you're afraid of everything and everybody, right? It's all fear. That's good. Next step is you can only be fearful if you have attacked God's Son. Because you push the guilt out and you're afraid it'll come back, right? You can only attack if you feel guilty. And you can only feel guilty if you believe you have committed a sin. And that is what Jesus wants us to look at with him. All this is just leading to this. You look at the attack upon God's Son, right? You look at all the judgments we make every day, and we realize the only reason why I'm making all those judgments is because I feel that I have sinned against God. I believe it. Otherwise, I wouldn't see differences. I wouldn't judge. I wouldn't attack, right? I believe I am sinful. You believe you are the home of evil, darkness, and sin, as lesson 93 says. That's what we believe, right? But if we were to look at this straight on, without Jesus, we would just go deeper into the insanity. We need the sane presence of love beside us and look at the sin that comes in so many forms to us every day, right? So every time we're afraid, every time we feel we attack somebody, every time we feel guilty or see the guilt in somebody else, we can now say and realize, okay, all this is because I must feel sinful. I must feel that I have done something so horrific that it cannot be undone. The stain of blood cannot be removed, as the Course says, right? Scarlet letter. You cannot remove the stain of blood. That is the ego says. That's what the ego says, and we believe it. And we need Jesus to tell us this is not the case. And my presence of my love over time will prove it to you. No intellectual trapeze movements, whatever you're doing with your mind, will do it. You must look at the sin that you believe in with the presence of love next to you. That is the solution. We look at all this in the world, all the times we're afraid, all the times we think we attack, right? We're attacking God's Son. All the times we think we feel guilty or see the guilt outside, and we realize it's all because I believe I killed God. And we talk to Jesus about it, and over time, the presence of Jesus' love in our mind, which is the course, right? The course is Jesus' love, the love of our right mind in material form. That presence of love, then we look at our belief in sin with that presence of love. One or of the two over time must disappear, because if you bring illusions to the truth, illusion must disappear. It cannot be obtained. It cannot be kept going, because it's an illusion, right? If you bring illusion to the truth, truth stays, illusion goes. If you keep them separate, you look at the illusion, it's real. You look at the truth, it's real. But they both still are real. That's what Christianity is, right? God is real, man is real, evil, good and evil, both real. The Course is non-dualistic, means there's truth and then there's illusion. So if we bring the sin, which is the illusion, because we cannot ever separate from God, which means we can't be sinful, we bring that to Jesus and say, please look at this sin, this belief in sin with me. Over time, the presence of love, nothing is going to happen. It basically, our belief in the illusion lessens. That's all. Our belief in sin over time lessens. If our belief in sin lessens, our guilt lessens, less cause to project, to attack God's Son, less fear. And that fear would then again cause to feel guilty. So this attack cycle would be broken just by us realizing that whatever our problems are, they can all be brought back to the single belief in our mind that we are sinful. The most heavily defended principle in the ego's arsenal is the belief in sin. I'm just going to read 2 paragraphs from that same section, chapter 11, section 4, the inheritance of God's Son, paragraph 7 and 8 as a closing. And if you read this, or if you listen or read it in the Course with this in mind, I don't know. Anyway, so at God's altar, Christ waits for the restoration of himself in you. God knows his Son as wholly blameless as himself, and he is approached through the appreciation of his Son. Christ waits for your acceptance of him as yourself and of his wholeness as yours. For Christ is the Son of God, who lives in his Creator and shines with his glory. Christ is the extension of the love and the loveliness of God, as perfect as his Creator and at peace with him. Blessed is the Son of God, whose radiance is of his Father, and whose glory he wills to share as his Father shares it with him. There is no condemnation in the Son, for there is no condemnation in the Father. Sharing the perfect love of the Father, the Son must share what belongs to him, for otherwise he will not know the Father or the Son. Peace be unto you who rest in God, and in whom the whole sonship rests. Amen.